You know, history is just packed with incredible stories, but few are as wild as the tale of the Roman Emperor Julian. I mean, this guy was the whole package, a brilliant philosopher, a winning general, and he had this burning ambition. He wanted to be the next Alexander the Great. But that drive for glory, it pushed him to make one of the most stunning, just jaw-dropping military calls ever. A gamble that not only sealed his own fate, but also cost his empire, big time. So let's get into it. This is the story of how it all went so wrong.
So Julian says, we have now provided some materials for the sophist of Antioch. You can just feel the swagger in that, right? He's basically saying to his friend back home, the famous orator Libanius, get your pen ready, buddy, because I'm making history here. This quote, it really captures him at the absolute peak of his power. His army is winning, the enemy's on the run, and in his mind, he's already a legend. For that one moment, he was totally on top of the world.
But this whole story really makes you ask a critical question, doesn't it? What happens when a leader's greatest strength, their supreme confidence, actually becomes their biggest weakness? It's like a timeless cautionary tale, right? About that super thin line between being a visionary leader and just fooling yourself. It shows how the very things that can make someone great can also, plant the seeds of their own downfall.
Okay, so to really get a handle on this fatal gamble of his, we first need to understand the man himself. Because Julian wasn't your typical emperor. He was a genuine intellectual, someone who really saw himself as a philosopher king, a person destined for something truly great.
And right here, you can see the central conflict raging inside the guy. On one hand, he looked up to emperors like Marcus Antonius, the wise, steady, stoic types. But on the other hand, there was this fire in his belly. The historian Edward Gibbon put it perfectly. He was inflamed by the glory of Alexander the Great, and that was the battle that would define his entire rule. The calm, thoughtful philosopher versus the world-conquering, glory-hungry warrior. So picture this. Julian's hanging out in Antioch, and he gets a message from the Persian king. They're offering peace. Now, a more careful emperor probably would have sat down and talked, right? Not Julian. He was just filled with contempt. He basically laughed it off and said he'd deliver his answer in person at the Persian capital. His goal wasn't peace, it was total conquest, an invasion that he wanted to be, in his own words, splendid and memorable. And so, the great invasion was on. And let me tell you, the force Julian put together was just immense. It was a true Roman juggernaut. As they pushed into Persian territory, success didn't just seem likely, it felt inevitable. Honestly, the start of this campaign was like a textbook example of Roman military might at its absolute best. 65,000 soldiers. Just let that sink in. This was the most numerous, well-drilled army any Caesar had ever led against Persia. We're talking hardened, effective veterans, a force literally built for one thing: total victory. And backing up all those troops, an absolutely massive fleet, 1,100 ships, cruising down the Euphrates River right alongside them. This fleet was the army's lifeline. It carried all their food, their weapons, and these huge siege engines. With this kind of support, Julian's army looked completely unstoppable, and their advance was just brutally quick. The city of Persepolis, it fell in only 2 days. Next up was the fortress of Magamalka, and this is where Julian got clever. He faked an attack on the main walls, but secretly he had his miners digging a tunnel right underneath the city. They popped up inside, catching the defenders completely off guard. After that, it was a massacre and the fortress was burned to the ground. Just like that, the Romans were knocking on the door of the Persian capital, Ctesiphon. So everything had gone perfectly. I mean, absolutely perfectly. Julian had outthought and outfought the Persians at every single turn. But it was right here, at the absolute pinnacle of his success, that he listened to some very bad advice and made a single decision. A decision he could never take back. A decision that would ultimately doom his entire army. This is when a supposed Persian nobleman shows up claiming to be a deserter. He tells Julian this amazing story, promising he can guide the Roman army on a secret route inland to trap and crush the Persian king's main force. Now, Julian's own generals, they were skeptical. They thought it sounded too good to be true. But Julian, blinded by his own success, trusted this stranger completely. And what did this guide convince him to do? He convinced him to burn his own fleet. Just let that sink in. He burned the ships. The entire fleet, that lifeline we talked about, the only source of supplies, the only way to retreat, was set on fire and destroyed. It is one of the most shocking military decisions in all of history. Now, Julian's logic, at least in his own head, was bold and heroic. He figured that by destroying any possibility of retreat, he would force his soldiers to choose between only two options: death or conquest, a real do-or-die moment. But the reality of what he'd just done, it was terrifying. He had just trapped his massive army deep inside enemy lands with no supply line, no escape route, and only about 20 days of food left. The consequences hit them almost instantly, and they were catastrophic. The glorious invasion, this splendid and memorable campaign, was about to turn into a desperate scramble for survival. A death march, really. And it would end with the emperor himself falling in battle. Yeah, almost overnight, the dream turned into a complete nightmare. That treacherous Persian guide, he vanished. His job was done. And the Persian army, which no longer had to worry about defending its cities, started a brutal scorched earth campaign. They just burned everything in front of the Romans. The landscape became what the historian Gibbon so powerfully called a smoking and naked desert. With supplies gone, the Romans started to starve. Their grand invasion was now a desperate retreat, and they were being picked off constantly by Persian cavalry. To his credit, Julian fought like a common soldier. He was everywhere, rushing from the front lines to the rear guard, trying to keep his men's spirits up. But in the crushing heat of the day, he'd made a fatal mistake. He'd taken off his body armor. While he was leading a charge against a retreating group of Persians, a volley of spears came flying at him. One of them caught him. It grazed his arm, pierced through his ribs, and buried itself deep in his liver. He just collapsed, falling unconscious from his horse. They carried him back to his tent, and in his final hours, Julian faced death not as a panicked general, but as the philosopher he'd always been. He calmly spoke to his grieving officers, telling them not to weep for him. He said, "I have learned from philosophy how much the soul is more excellent than the body. I die without remorse as I have lived without guilt." He was a Stoic right to the very end, and he died around midnight, leaving his army completely leaderless in the middle of a hostile desert. So Julian was dead, but the disaster, it was far from over. You've still got this massive, starving, and now totally panicked Roman army trapped in enemy territory. They had to pick a new leader, and fast, and the guy they chose was about to be forced to pay an absolutely unthinkable price just to save what was left of his men. Out of sheer desperation, the soldiers proclaimed an officer named Jovian as the new emperor. Now, Jovian wasn't some famous general or celebrated nobleman. In fact, one historian basically called him a nobody. And this nobody had just been handed one of the most desperate, hopeless situations any Roman emperor had ever faced. Completely surrounded and with absolutely no way out, Jovian had no choice but to negotiate a peace. And the terms? They were just humiliating. Rome had to give up 5 entire provinces beyond the Tigris River, territory that past emperors had fought and died for. They had to surrender major fortresses, including the great city of Nisibis. I mean, this city was famous, a legend known as the firmest bulwark of the East because it had held out against the Persians time and time again. And Jovian just handed it over. They even had to abandon their key ally, the Kingdom of Armenia. This wasn't a peace treaty. It was a total and complete surrender. And the historian Edward Gibbon really put the significance of this moment into perspective. He wrote that since the foundation of the city, the genius of Rome, the god Terminus, who guarded the boundaries of the Republic, had never retired before the sword of a victorious enemy. Think about that. For the first time in its entire history, Rome wasn't just adjusting its borders. It was giving up land because it had been beaten. The symbolic protector of its frontiers was, for the very first time, retreating. So in the end, Julian's gamble was an unmitigated disaster, a total catastrophe. But what if it had worked? If he'd actually pulled it off, we'd probably be talking about him as one of the great military geniuses, praising his bold and decisive move. And that leaves us with a really tough question, doesn't it? How do we judge a leader's legacy? Is it about their bold vision and their ambition, or is it all about the final brutal outcome? Julian's story, it really doesn't give us any easy answers.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really critical moment from Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's this incredible story about two brothers who basically inherited a total crisis and ended up splitting the world's greatest power right in two. So this was the terrifying question facing Rome back in 363 AD. The Emperor Julian had just died during this disastrous war in Persia, and it left the entire empire, as Gibbon puts it, in a doubtful and dangerous situation. I mean, the whole machine of the state was just grinding to a halt.
Yeah, the empire was just a total powder keg. On the inside, you had Christians and pagans basically at each other's throats. And on the outside, they just signed this humiliating treaty with Persia just to save the army. So Julian's successor, a guy named Jovian, he tries to calm things down. But, well, his reign turned out to be shockingly brief. So, after just 7 really frantic months on the throne, Jovian is found dead. And the cause? Well, it's a bit of a mystery. Gibbon suggests it could have been a really bad case of indigestion, from wine and mushrooms. Or, and this is probably more likely, that he suffocated from the fumes of a charcoal heater in a freshly plastered room. Crazy, right? But whatever the reason, Rome was leaderless. Again, so out of this power vacuum, the army and the top ministers, they had to make a choice. And they didn't go for some philosopher or a seasoned politician. Nope, they picked a soldier, a man who was forged on the really brutal frontiers of the empire. His name was Valentinian, and this guy was a career military man through and through. He's described as tall, really imposing, with a look that, quote, inspired his friends with awe and his enemies with fear. So definitely not a scholar, but he absolutely knew command, he knew discipline, and he knew the harsh realities of power. And you know what? Valentinian's very first act as emperor was just a masterclass in control. As the army is cheering for him, they start demanding that he name a co-emperor right there on the spot. But he just calmly silences the whole crowd. He tells them, look, I agree the job is too big for one man, but the choice is going to be mine and mine alone. He promised them a partner, but it was going to be on his terms and on his timeline.
So here's advisors. They gave him some really sound counsel. One of his generals laid out the choice just perfectly. He said, if you consider only your family, you have a brother. If you love the Republic, look for the most deserving of the Romans. Valentinian listens, and then he chooses family. He picks his own brother, Valens, a man with 0 military or civil experience. His only qualification? Deep, unquestioning loyalty. And that choice, well, it would echo for a century.
And this choice led directly to one of the most pivotal moments in all of Roman history. At a palace in the Balkans, the two brothers officially, formally split the empire. And this wasn't just some temporary administrative thing. No, this was the creation of 2 separate governments, 2 courts, 2 completely separate destinies. It's a decision you could look at as the only way to manage a collapsing state, or maybe the very act that guaranteed it would eventually fracture for good.
So here's how that division actually looked. Valentinian, the tough, seasoned general, he takes the turbulent west, with all its warlike frontiers from Italy to Gaul, and he sets up a temporary capital in Milan. Meanwhile, Valens, his totally inexperienced brother, he gets the wealthier, more stable east, and he rules from Constantinople. But here's the kicker for Valens. He was sent to govern this massive territory where the main language was Greek, a language he couldn't even speak.
Now, the joint reign of these 2 incredibly different brothers, well, it was a bizarre mix. You had some surprisingly forward-thinking governance, and then you had this terrifying personal cruelty.
I mean, on their good days, they were actually remarkable rulers. They passed laws that feel almost modern. They created what was essentially a public healthcare system in Rome with salaried doctors. And they even established state-funded universities in major cities. They took steps to protect newborn infants from being abandoned. And in the West, Valentinian, despite being a devout Christian himself, was a fierce defender of religious freedom for everyone.
But, and this is a huge but, all of this enlightened policymaking existed right alongside this horrifying brutality. Strike off his head, burn him alive, beat him with clubs till he expires. Gibbon tells us these were literally Valentinian's go-to phrases. The slightest offense, like a hasty word or an accidental delay, could get you punished with an immediate, gruesome death.
And nothing, I mean nothing, captures the dark side of his personality quite like his pets. You're not going to believe this. He kept 2 massive bears, and he ironically named them Innocence and Mica Aurea, which means golden sweetie. Their cages were placed right near his bedroom, and he would often just amuse himself by watching them tear apart condemned criminals. This was a man, as Gibbon points out, who saved his friendship for servants with tempers as foul as his own, and of course, for his bears.
So here's the crucial point. Both brothers were incredibly cruel, but their cruelty came from totally different places. Valentinian's cruelty was born from a volcanic, uncontrollable temper. He honestly seemed to think his rage was a form of justice. Valens, on the other hand, was timid and fearful. His cruelty came from paranoia, this deep-seated anxiety where, as Gibbon says, suspicion is equivalent to proof. One was driven by rage, the other by fear.
And for Valentinian, this core personality flaw, his explosive anger, it wouldn't just define his reign. No, in a moment of almost poetic irony, it would be the direct cause of his death.
Okay, so the scene is a military camp on the Danube River. A delegation of barbarian leaders from the Quadi tribe, who had just been at war with Rome, they show up to plead for peace. They came looking for mercy, but what they found was an emperor who is basically primed to detonate.
So, as the ambassadors are making their case, trying to blame a few rogue actors for the war, Valentinian's temper just flares. He launches into this furious tirade, his face turning purple, his voice just roaring. And right in the middle of this ungoverned fury, a blood vessel just bursts. He collapses, can't speak, and dies within minutes. The man who ruled by rage was, in the end, literally killed by it.
Valentinian's sudden, violent death immediately threw the Western Empire into total disarray. It left this huge power vacuum that his ambitious generals were all too eager to fill for themselves.
See, his official heir, Gratian, was a pretty capable 17-year-old, but he was hundreds of miles away at the time. So the generals who were right there on the scene, they took matters into their own hands. To secure their own power, they elevated Valentinian's other son, a 4-year-old toddler, also named Valentinian, as a co-emperor. A 4-year-old.
And just like that, the Roman world now had 3 emperors. You had Valens still in the east, and now the west was being ruled by a teenager, Gratian, and his 4-year-old brother. That division that Valentinian created out of what he saw as practicality was now fracturing even further. The fate of the entire world was now resting in the hands of a paranoid uncle and 2 kids.
And this all leaves us with a really fundamental question, doesn't it? Was Valentinian's decision to split the empire a smart, pragmatic move that actually prolonged its life by making it more manageable? Or did creating 2 separate courts, 2 separate armies, and 2 sets of interests just make sure that when the final crisis came, the East and West would have to face it all alone? It's a debate that historians still argue about to this day.
Today, we're digging into Edward Gibbon's absolute masterpiece, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, to look at one of the most catastrophic days in all of Roman history. We're talking about a single, disastrous battle that really did change everything. Just think about those words for a second. That's a historian writing at the time, describing what happened to the Roman emperor. He wasn't captured, he didn't escape, he was just gone, buried under a literal mountain of his own dead soldiers. So let's just be crystal clear about what this meant. On this one day, the entire Eastern Roman army was, for all intents and purposes, wiped off the map. It was a military disaster on a scale Rome hadn't seen in hundreds of years. And the worst part? It happened inside its own borders. Okay, to really get a grip on how huge this was, let's put it in perspective. For generations, Romans had nightmares about the Battle of Cannae. You know, their legendary defeat by Hannibal. But Hadrianopolis? It was arguably even worse. At Cannae, sure, they lost a consul, a high-ranking official. At Hadrianopolis, They lost the reigning emperor himself. Cannae was a terrible crisis, but Rome survived. Hadrianopolis, that was a wound that the Western Empire would never, ever recover from.
So you gotta ask, right? How did this happen? How did the most sophisticated, most powerful military machine in the ancient world get so completely crushed? Not in some far-flung land, but right in their own backyard. Well, to figure that out, we have to look at where the pressure really started. Because this story doesn't begin on the battlefield. No, it starts hundreds and hundreds of miles away, with a force that kicked this whole catastrophe into motion.
Gibbon calls them the original principle of motion, the Huns. This was this formidable confederation of nomadic warriors that just erupted out of Central Asia, and they created a shockwave that was about to crash right onto the Roman frontier.
And this push from the east set off a devastating domino effect. First, the Huns just roll right over the Alani. Then, that combined force smashes into the Gothic Empire. And the Goths, who were a proud and powerful people in their own right, they were completely broken. Their king was dead, and their entire nation, terrified, desperate, fled for their lives, running west until they simply couldn't run anymore. They ended up on the banks of the Danube River, which was the border of the Roman Empire.
But hold on. Before we see what happens at that border, we really need to understand why these migrating peoples, like the Goths, were such an incredible military force to begin with.
So, what was their secret weapon? It wasn't better swords or some kind of grand strategy. No, according to Gibbon, their entire way of life was, in itself, a kind of military training. Gibbon boils it down to three key things that made these nomadic cultures, which he calls Scythian, just perfectly adapted for war. It all came down to their diet, their idea of a home, and their daily activities, or exercises. Their whole society was basically one giant military training camp.
I mean, the contrast here is just night and day. For a Roman, being a soldier was a profession, supported by a slow, complicated supply chain from the cities. But for a Gothic shepherd, his supply train was his flock of animals, moving right along with him. His camp was his country, and his daily life, all that constant riding and hunting, was basically a non-stop school for war. These guys were always ready to fight.
Okay, so let's get back to that border. You've got this desperate nation of warriors on one side, begging to be let in. And on the other, you have a Roman administration that is about to make one catastrophic mistake after another. And we are not talking about a small raiding party here. Citing ancient sources, Gibbon suggests the number of Goths, men, women, and children who showed up at the Danube was mind-blowing, potentially close to 1 million people. This wasn't just a border issue. It was a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions.
Emperor Valens agrees to let them cross, but under some very harsh conditions. And this is where it all goes so horribly wrong. Rome demands the Goths give up their weapons, but corrupt Roman officials immediately start taking bribes to let them keep their swords. Rome promises to feed them, but the local commanders create a man-made famine, selling them the meat of diseased dogs at insane prices. And maybe worst of all, Rome takes their children as hostages and scatters them across the empire into slavery. They literally turn desperate refugees into sworn enemies.
So, of course, the Goths revolt. And after their first big victory against the local Roman army, the Gothic historian Jordanus just nails it with this quote. He says, "That day ended the suffering of the barbarians and the security of the Romans. The refugees were now the masters of the province."
This massive revolt leads directly to the Battle of Hadrianople, and after that imperial disaster, the new emperor, Theodosius, has to somehow pick up the pieces and try to find a solution.
So let's just recap the timeline here, because it's fast and brutal. The Goths cross the Danube in 376. Just 2 years later, they destroy a Roman army and kill the emperor. It then takes the new guy, Theodosius, 4 more years of careful fighting and diplomacy to finally end the war with a formal treaty.
And the solution he came up with was radical. Instead of kicking the Goths out or trying to destroy them, Theodosius makes them foederati, or allies. This meant settling an entire, armed, barbarian nation inside Roman territory, letting them live under their own chiefs and their own laws in exchange for fighting for Rome. It was a state within a state, something completely unheard of.
The actual terms of this deal were just extraordinary. The Goths were given prime real estate in Thrace. They were totally exempt from Roman taxes and Roman laws. They were governed by their own leaders, and in return, about 40,000 Goths would serve as a paid allied army for Rome. In essence, Rome outsourced a huge part of its national defense to the very people who had just killed their emperor. It was a pragmatic peace, for sure, but an incredibly dangerous one.
But there was a catch.
a really big one. Gibbon reports this widespread suspicion among the Romans that the whole peace deal was a sham, that the Goths had secretly sworn an oath to just play along, bide their time, and wait for the perfect moment to start their conquest again, but this time from the inside.
Which leaves us with the ultimate unsettling question. Theodosius' treaty, yeah, it ended the war, it brought back some stability for a little while. But by welcoming an entire autonomous warrior nation inside the gates, had he actually saved Rome? Or had he just postponed the inevitable and institutionalized the very force that would, just a few decades later, bring the whole Western Empire crashing down? In this explainer, we're cracking open a really intense chapter from Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's this incredible story about faith, about raw power, and a showdown that honestly shaped the next 1,000 years of Western history.
So, it all boils down to this one question. Who was really in charge of the late Roman Empire? You know, when the chips were down, who held the real power? Was it the guy with the legions and the laws, or was it the guy who had God in his corner?
So you've got these two titans, right? On one side, you have the emperor. He's got the armies, he's got the entire machinery of the state behind him. But on the other side, you have the bishop, a totally different kind of power, one that's built on faith and the loyalty of his flock. And these two forces, they're on a collision course.
Now you might be wondering, how could a bishop even think about challenging an emperor? Well, to get that, we have to look at how the emperor's authority was already starting to crumble. And our story really kicks off with this emperor named Gratian, a guy who started with so much promise but ended in total catastrophe. So, Gratian, he comes to power and everyone's celebrating. He's got this amazing reputation. But it all goes south, fast. He starts ignoring the actual job of being emperor to go hunting all the time. And then he makes this one huge mistake. He starts favoring his barbarian guards over his own Roman soldiers, even dressing like them. For the legions, this was just a slap in the face, a total betrayal.
And the backlash? Oh, it was brutal and fast. A general over in Britain, Maximus, gets himself declared emperor. And what did Gratian's armies in Gaul do? They just abandon him. They walk away. He's left all alone, hunted down, and assassinated. This creates this massive power vacuum, and it sends a shockwave through the empire. The message was crystal clear. Being emperor didn't mean you were untouchable anymore.
Okay, so with all that chaos as a backdrop, enter one of our main characters, Theodosius, the Emperor of the East. And he looks at this mess, the rebellions, the instability, and he comes to a pretty intense conclusion. He decides the only way to hold the empire together isn't just with soldiers, but with an iron fist of religious orthodoxy. One empire, one God, one faith. His faith.
The huge religious fight at the time was all about something called Arianism. It had been tearing Christians apart for ages. The core question was this: was Jesus the Son, created by God the Father, and therefore, a little less divine, or were they perfectly equal? For most people, it was a complex theological debate. For Theodosius, no debate at all. Arianism was heresy, plain and simple. And he was going to crush it.
And just look at the language he uses in his official edict. It's wow. He says, "We authorize the followers of this doctrine," meaning his own, "to assume the title of Catholic Christians." And everyone else, he calls them extravagant madmen and officially brands them heretics. This wasn't just a suggestion. It meant you were now an enemy of the state, facing punishment from him, and, he claimed, from God.
To give you an idea of how obsessed everyone was with this stuff, Gibbon shares this fantastic quote from a contemporary. It says that in Constantinople, you'd go to buy a loaf of bread, and the baker, instead of telling you the price, would start arguing that the Son is inferior to the Father. I mean, it was everywhere. Theological debate was the pop culture of the day, and Theodosius was determined to end the conversation by force.
So while Theodosius is laying down the law in the East, an equally strong-willed figure is making waves in the West. This is our other main character, Ambrose, the Archbishop of Milan. And he's about to show the world what happens when spiritual power gets wielded like a political weapon.
And Ambrose's backstory is just incredible. Get this, he wasn't even a clergyman. He was the civil governor of Milan, a politician, and apparently a really popular one. So when the old archbishop dies, the crowd literally starts chanting for Ambrose to take the job. He was a man who already knew the ins and outs of power, and now he had this immense spiritual office. It's a dangerous combination for any emperor.
So the big confrontation comes when the empress, who was an Arian, demands that Ambrose hand over one of the basilicas in Milan for her fellow Arians to use. Ambrose's response is legendary. He basically says, the emperor can have the palaces, but the churches belong to God. He drew a line in the sand, a physical line around the church and a metaphysical one. He was declaring that imperial power stopped at the church door.
And Ambrose wasn't just talk. He was a brilliant strategist. First, he refused the order. Then, he and his followers barricaded themselves inside the basilica. It's a standoff. To keep everyone's spirits up, he introduces congregational singing, something new at the time. But here's the masterstroke. Right at the peak of the tension, he announces he's discovered the long-lost relics of two martyrs right there in Milan. The city goes wild. It's seen as a sign from God. The imperial court had no choice but to back down. The bishop, using popular support and divine theater, had faced down the empire and won.
All right, so now we have our two power players established. Theodosius, the unbending emperor, Ambrose, the defiant bishop. It was only a matter of time before they clashed directly, and the event that finally brings them head-to-head is just horrific. An act of imperial violence so shocking it couldn't be ignored.
So here's the trigger. There's a riot in a city called Thessalonica. It gets out of hand, and a popular Roman general is killed. When the news reaches Theodosius, he just snaps. You have to remember, this was a man with a volcanic temper. He doesn't order an investigation. He doesn't ask for the ringleaders to be arrested. He gives a single, terrible order. Kill them all.
His soldiers march into the city circus, where thousands of people are gathered for the games, and they just start killing for 3 hours. Men, women, children. The number that comes down to us is 7,000 people murdered. This wasn't a battle. It was a state-sponsored slaughter. And back in Milan, when Bishop Ambrose hears about this, he knows he has to act. This could not go unanswered.
What Ambrose does next is one of the boldest moves in political history. He doesn't just send a letter of protest. He excommunicates the emperor. He publicly bars Theodosius from setting foot in church. Think about that. He declared the absolute ruler of the Roman world to be spiritually contaminated, a pariah in the eyes of God.
This was completely unheard of. A total crisis. The most powerful man on the planet, publicly shamed and spiritually cast out by a bishop. So what happens now? Does the emperor send his soldiers to arrest Ambrose? Does he ignore him? Who backs down?
At one point, Theodosius tries to defend himself, comparing his sin to that of the biblical King David. And Ambrose's reply is just, checkmate. He says, you have imitated David in his crime. Imitate then his repentance. He's not asking for a private apology. He's demanding a public, humiliating spectacle of penance. He's forcing the emperor to submit, not to him, but to the authority of the church.
And the most incredible thing happens. Theodosius breaks. He submits. For 8 months, the emperor of Rome performs public penance. He lays aside his royal robes, stands in the church, and publicly begs for forgiveness. A bishop had stared down an emperor, and the emperor had blinked. In that moment, the entire power dynamic between church and state shifted forever. Now, after this incredibly humbling experience, Theodosius actually goes on to have one last massive military victory. He marches west one more time, defeats yet another rival emperor, and for one very brief, shining moment, he holds the entire Roman Empire, east and west, under his solo command.
So in 394, he does it. He becomes the last man who will ever rule a unified Roman Empire. But you have to understand how fragile this moment was. It was unbelievably fleeting. Just a few months after this final victory, Theodosius dies. He splits the empire between his 2 sons, and it would never, ever be whole again.
So what are we supposed to make of all this? The emperor versus the bishop. What does it all mean? Well, Gibbon leaves us with one last chilling piece of the puzzle. He points out that while all this high-level drama was happening, something was going deeply wrong with the very foundation of Roman power. The army.
He digs up this quote from a military writer of the time, and it's just stunning. It basically says that from the day Rome was founded, for century after century, right up until the reign of Gratian, the guy we started with, Roman infantry always wore their armor. It was non-negotiable.
But by this point, the discipline had collapsed. The soldiers were actually complaining that their armor was too heavy, and their commanders were letting them get away with it. They were allowed to just take off their helmets and their breastplates. So the heirs to the legions that had conquered the known world were now, as Gibbon puts it, marching into battle naked and trembling against barbarian archers. It's an unbelievable image of decay.
And that brings us to the final, haunting question. You have an emperor who's been humbled by the church, a profound shift in the empire's spirit. And at the same time, you have its soldiers literally casting off their armor, a fatal decay in the empire's physical body. So, with its soul in conflict and its body undefended, was the fall of the West now just a matter of time?